Welcome to the About Sex podcast. I'm your host, Angela Skirtu. I'm a licensed marriage therapist in the state of Missouri and an ASEX certified sex therapist. You can find me at www.therapistintstlouis.com. Today, I am interviewing Shirley Melis. Is it Melis? Is that how I should pronounce it? Awesome.
Yes, it is.
She is the author of Banged Up Heart, Dancing with Love and Loss. And actually, Shirley, it's your second time showing up on my show, correct?
Correct. Yes. I was on just shortly after my book came out.
Yeah.
And now I'm on shortly after the audiobook came out.
That's exciting. Well, so tell everybody a little bit about the book.
Well, in a nutshell, I was widowed for a couple of years and then swept into a whirlwind courtship by a younger man, a rocket scientist. And soon we were traveling, living our dreams, photography for him, writing for me. But little more than a year later, tragedy stopped us in our tracks. Oh, no. So my book is, it's about courage and resilience. And I would say it's about accepting that life isn't just what happens to us, but more importantly, how we deal with it.
Well, so what were some of the challenges then? Like, it sounds like, first of all, you're dating a rocket science. Who can say that? But then also, so it sounds like you were together for a year and you got that great romantic period. But then what happened that kind of stopped you guys in your tracks?
Well, what stopped us, he had told me when we first met, he told me he'd been diagnosed with a rare blood cancer when he was 40. And this is some years after that. And he was so positive about his health that I didn't focus on it. Mm-hmm. And I was more interested in character, and he about his health said he was treated with a non-chemo infusion every 9 or 10 or 12 months. And then he said there were backup treatments in the wings, and he felt a positive attitude was important. And so then I just went into the character issues, and and they all came. And it was just, so what happened, the cancer showed up. And as a bump on his forehead. We'd been to Africa, we'd been to Brittany, France, and we were on a road trip up to Puget Sound from Santa Fe, and we were visiting our childhood haunts and sort of introducing each other to various relatives and friends. Because I grew up in Northern California, so we were making that trek, and he'd grown up in Wyoming, and so everything sort of converged. And then just discovered, I discovered on one morning, I was just we were in bed and I was caressing his face, and I said, "Oh my God," I said, "there's a lump the size of a quail egg on your forehead under your shock of hair." And he said, "Well, he says, I think I remember hitting my head when I was, after changing all the computer cords in the condo,
Oh, okay.
Which sounded plausible to me. Even it wasn't black and blue. It was just a lump covered by skin, flesh. And it turned out to be that the cancer was really active. And then we were in a whole sort of trying to save his life.
What was it like going through that? Like going through cancer with somebody you really loved? Because I know that's a hard thing for a lot of people.
I was, it took a while for the diagnosis to be made. He was getting the infusion to, keep his cancer at bay when the doctor when he had the lump. The lump was there, and he went in to have the infusion, and I said, "Are you going to tell the doctor about the bump on your forehead?" He says, "Oh, yeah, by the way, I have this bump on my forehead."
He was doing it as a side story. It's like, "Oh, yeah, this is happening too."
Right. So the doctor says, "Well, you better have it x-rayed." He says, "I can't tell by looking what that is." So he just had a regular x-ray, and then he goes back for another infusion of this something's called Rituxan. It's non-chemo, but sort of similar. And the doctor was on vacation, but his assistant said, well, the doctor wants you to have a CAT scan because he can't tell anything from the X-ray. So we did that, and that's when I started to become a little concerned. And that was the telling report. So the diagnosis was made, and that really knocked me for a loop. But then we started the process of trying to stop it. And I thought, well, my father had cancer. He had, and it had gone into remission. And I thought, well, why can't that happen for John?
Yeah.
Because I was sort of oblivious to the fact that he'd been staving this off for 18 years. And, at that point, I guess maybe it was 16. Yeah.
I see. So you kind of hadn't talked a lot about this. I mean, you knew that he had this issue, but you didn't really go in depth.
You're right. And I didn't really know how severe it could be or was. And at some point, I remember talking with his brother. His brother says, "Oh God, John has a medical file 2 inches thick." I said, "Oh." It's like I should have known that, Well, I didn't know that. So he had been susceptible to some like salmonella and other infections, and but those actually had occurred maybe 7 years earlier. So I thought, it's going to be okay. So I was in denial. I was in denial a lot. I just kept hoping, and maybe I think he was more realistic, but I think he was also hopeful.
Well, I think he wanted to make you happy too, right? I mean, you don't know. It's hard to deal with your medical issues. So my guess is he didn't want to. I know this is going to sound weird, but bring down the mood of the relationship. Is that the right way to say that? I don't know.
I was a perfect receptor of that because I didn't want to bring it down either, and we just kept going until he had surgery, he had radiation, and it was just, and then at some point, he said no to the chemo. And he said, look, I know what can happen with chemo and the side effects, and I'm not going to do it. And he said this to the doctor, and the doctor said, well, I want you to think about it over the weekend because this is a new thing, and he wanted a new chemo, and he wanted to try it. He said it was iffy, but he really wanted to. And I should say the doctor did mention the side effects, which you'd be susceptible. I mean, your immune system is down, you're susceptible to infection, and he'd been hospitalized, it turned out, with infection. When I thought it was a cancer, it was an infection. Oh. And so, in any case, he said, no, he said, I want to have the best time that Shirley and I can have together. And he says, if I do that chemo, it won't be the best last time. So he didn't.
Do you ever think back about that decision? Like, would you, I'm not meaning to start regret or anything, but like.
No, not with her. I'm grateful that he did. I'm grateful because I had seen him. He'd been, when I thought it was when he was practically immobilized, it turned out it wasn't the cancer that I had imagined. It was an infection. And I just thought, he nearly died that time in the hospital. So I just visualizing him being rehospitalized with another infection just didn't compute. So I thought his was good.
I wonder, what other people, so like there's people who maybe have said things one way or another. Your book's been out for a while, and I know the audiobook came out. I'm curious if you get any flack or criticism from those people who are like, no, you need to work as hard as you can. You need to do every single medical treatment? Or have you gotten the opposite from listeners and readers?
People haven't commented on that aspect, really. I have a classmate, a college classmate whose husband died about the age of John, and he had he had cancer, and he had surgery after surgery. And at the time, I just, at the memorial service, I just felt what an ordeal. I mean, and I think some medical establishments, the doctors are trained to take the Hippocratic Oath. They want to keep you alive, and the quality of life in order to keep you alive is sometimes very iffy. And I feel really strongly that the quality of life is important. And even we knew that John was going to die, but we did have good moments in the last months.
Well, that makes a lot of sense. If you think about just spending the rest of your life in the hospital, say you only have a few months, it's like, do you want most of that time to be in a hospital bed where you're barely able to move or do anything? Or do you want to be living out in the world and being with the people you love and care about? And I think it's a hard decision for everybody to make, when they get to that space.
Yeah, and it is a decision. It is, well, sometimes there's no time to have a decision.
Yeah, that's true.
In this case, he did, and I'm really grateful that he said no to the treatment. And what was sort of surprising to me is that because I've been accustomed to seeing the oncologist with John, and once John said no, that was the end. I mean, it's like
we broke up with our oncologist.
Yeah, we broke up. Yeah, we broke up with him.
It just wasn't working out.
Yeah, isn't that something? It's just, and that's just the way it is. Oh my God! And suddenly we were dating the hospice people, the hospice team.
Now that's an interesting romantic book.
Oh God! And actually, they did have a whole team, and the nurse and social worker were the ones who we saw them regularly, and until John said, I don't want to see them every week. He called and he said, please, I don't want to see you every week as much as I like you. And she said, could you please make it every 2 weeks? She says, well, she was really reluctant. This is the nurse. And she said, well, as long as you call me. If you call me, then okay, I won't come over. I was really surprised she agreed but anyway, she did, and it was fine.
I'm kind of curious what your thoughts are about end-of-life issues. I think what your book is doing is it's really putting together a couple themes. One is love and romance, but another one is end-of-life and how does a couple really work through that as a team. And what I'm seeing in my own life, I'm getting into middle age more, and I'm considering, so my father, for example, I asked him, I said, hey, Dad, do you have any sort of end-of-life plan or like graves? And he's like, oh yeah, our family has graves. We have 11 somewhere. And I was like, where?
Somewhere.
Where are they? And he's like, oh, you just got to call them. And I was like, who do I have to call, Dad? And I realized he has no plan. And a lot of people don't. Like, to your point earlier, you were saying sometimes this stuff just happens to you and you kind of have to make these decisions. What do you think makes it so hard for people to face end-of-life choices like this?
Oh, I think we're so afraid of dying.
Yeah.
And that's sort of admitting that the inevitable is going to really happen.
No, I'm going to live forever. That's not true, Shirley.
Yeah, exactly. You mentioned your dad, and my father was very specific years before. He said, there's a family plot. I think it was after he retired, but he says, we have a family plot in this little place in Oregon, and he said, and when the time comes, my parents they were going to be cremated. They decided that, and I was with them when they went to the attorney and did this stuff. And at that point, they were, as far as I knew, healthy and certainly had their wits about them, and I witnessed this. But then he got more specific after that. He said, okay, so he said, here are the plot numbers, and
Mm-hmm.
he said, and after my mother died 4 years before he did, and then we saved her ashes until my father died, so that they would be buried at the same time. But he says, I want mine to be, it was in the family plot, between my mother, my grandmother, want my ashes to be between your grandmother and your mother. He says, because they didn't get along, and this will keep the peace.
I love that. Well, you know what? He was planning ahead. There was going to be a lifetime under there, so they needed to have a good situation.
Yeah, that was sort of took me by surprise.
Well, heck, at least he had a plan.
Yes. And, as far as with my first husband died suddenly after surgery to replace his aortic valve. But he survived the surgery, but 17 days later he died in a rehab center. He's supposed to be getting stronger to come home, and he had a heart attack. So, but he didn't care about. He said, I don't think he was a lot older than. And he said at one point, he says, when I die, he says, I don't think you should have a memorial service. He said, I would hate for there not to be a crowd. He said, most of the people I know have died, But
but to the original question, it sounds like if for people who are kind of planning to live until maybe their 60s, 70s, 80s, and they're like, okay, but I've lived my life, I'm going to die, then maybe there's a plan there. But when things kind of happen all of a sudden, like in actually both cases for you, right? Those first two relationships, they kind of died suddenly, unexpected. Not fully unexpectedly with your second husband.
Yeah, not fully unexpectedly. And with John, it was... We had some time, and I had been trained to. I was in PR for a lot of years, and my first husband was in that public affairs area too. And I said, John, when I said, I'm going to write the obit. This is just part of my training, my life, and so I wrote it, and I had him edit it, I said, there's some things I don't know, So I said, so where do you think I should send this? And he said, he says, I think most places will not be interested. Well, I think that, the papers in Laramie and the papers in Southern California, where he did his rocket science stuff, and I think there are few might. So he went along with that, and then at some point he actually said, he said, I think maybe you should have two more memorial services, one in Santa Fe and one in Reston, Virginia, where we lived most of the time, and one in Santa Fe, where he had lived before meeting me. And so I did do that, and he said that at one point he thought he wanted his ashes scattered in the Snowy Range, which is a range of mountains where his parents' he and his brothers scattered their parents' ashes there. And I had been there. I visited there. And he said, no. He says, I don't want that now. He says, I just scatter my ashes in the mountains near Santa Fe. So I had to sort of figure out where that might be, because we'd never visited the mountains near Santa Fe together.
But it sounds sweet that you were really willing to honor his wishes. I am also curious, what was it like writing the book? Because it is kind of hard. You're doing a memoir here, so you're essentially putting your story out there. What was that like for you?
Well, it was. I felt compelled to write it, and at first I was just going to celebrate our relationship, because we were married officially 2 years and 1 week, and it was so short. It was as though John died during the honeymoon period. Mm-hmm. So I was going to celebrate our relationship, and I had a journal. I had lots of emails that I had sent to people during the process, the whole last 9 months. And so I relived a lot of the pain, but also the joy. Mm. So it wasn't. It was more compelling in that way. I just kept going, and it was joyful and tearful all at the same time.
It sounds like it was kind of a therapeutic journey for you.
It was. I mean, I can't say it saved my life, but it kept me moving. It kept me moving, mm-hmm. And then afterwards, I have a goddaughter who is an author for books for middle school age children, and she read the first 60 pages, and she said, "Oh, Shirley, you've got to keep writing. This will be interesting for other people." And she said, "You've got to write about Joe, my first husband, whom she knew and was crazy about." And so I did that. I wrote about Joe, and I wrote about my Greek lover, and my troubled mother, and I had this voluminous manuscript. And so, but I knew something was missing. And I met the editor, who said, "Well," she accepted it. I said, "I know something's missing." And 2 weeks later, she called and she says, "I know exactly what's missing." So we met again, and she said, "For starters," she said, "you have 3 books or 4 books in one." she said, "I've made a note of how many pages in each, and I think you should go with where your energy is." So that was the relationship with my second husband. But then I layered it. And what I found is that there was a lot of drama in that 2.5-year time period, but I had just written the visible story. I hadn't written about my feelings, my deep feelings, and I hadn't reflected on those feelings from where I am now. So that was the rewrite, which really enriched my story, and I had to put myself back into the zone of the moment to really acknowledge the feelings that I had. And then I had to step back and say, well, now this is this is what I think about that.
Yeah, because I imagine you write it, you kind of express it, but then it's like you're reliving it again, even that third time, but like at a deeper level. Like you're really kind of putting it, I guess honoring it is the word I would want to use. It's like, oh, that's what happened to me.
That's good, because I didn't know what had happened. And writing has often helped me see more clearly. And, I was wondering, I sort of started out celebrating the relationship, and then I got to be a little more curious about things and wondering whether John had intentionally kept the severity of his illness a secret from me. And yet he had told me about it when I first met him. So, any case, it was an exploration that brought me sort of a more nuanced understanding of him and his behavior toward me, and some insights about myself too.
Well, you know what it makes me kind of think about is just how men handle illness in general. I don't think they give themselves a lot of freedom to be weak. And so what demonstrates weakness more than illness and your body kind of falling apart? I don't know, these are just my ramblings, but I sometimes wonder if it's just shame around being sick or ill that kind of makes men hold back and not share some of that stuff because they want to kind of be stoic and strong.
Well, I think in John's case, that was his way of surviving it, because it was such a blow, I think, when he was diagnosed. I mean, he was working full bore when he said suddenly he couldn't go across a tennis court. He just couldn't run across a tennis court, and he had something called an executive physical that he could get, and he got it, and it was blood work. I guess it was blood work, but finally someone diagnosed his cancer. It's called Waldenstrom's macroglobulinemia, and there are maybe 1,500 cases of it a year, and it's just a very minor in terms of numbers. But in any case, it with a big impact. But he really felt, I think, in order for him to keep going, he did a lot, and he always had plans. And he said, it's important to have plans. He says life interferes, but it's important to have plans. And he didn't look back with regret if some things he didn't turn out. I mean, he had thought. He had been in Brittany on business, and then they had these crepes, these great crepes with cheese, not dessert crepes, but crepes you fill with cheese and ham and all this, and they're sort of very good, and they're very good with this alcoholic cider.
I'm really hungry now. Why are you doing that to me, Shirley?
Right, it's almost lunchtime, isn't it? Well, in any case, so he decided he wanted to try to import this cider and sell this alcoholic cider in L.A. So he got all these licenses, and he went back to Brittany, and his friends there took him to these various cider places, just small businesses, but ones that would send the cider, and the day that everything was to arrive in L.A., the dock, wherever, John was flat out, and they had thought he had a stroke, but it was meningitis, spinal meningitis. And in any case, that was the end of the cider business. And he didn't go back. He didn't. Everything just stayed on. He didn't try to revive it, and he didn't express any. I mean, I didn't know him then, but when he talked about it, he says, "Look, it was over." He says, "I had to do other things." So, so it was a way of, I think, for him surviving sort of a devastating diagnosis, but it kept him going to just not concentrate on it. I mean, he was aware of it, and he knew when he had to have treatments. He kept a little log of this protein in his system, this IgM, and when it got up to a certain point, that meant, and it had to do with, I'm sure, his feeling too, sweats or whatever. Then he would go in for the treatment, and then start that cycle. So he was not unaware of that cycle, but he certainly had, kept going on new projects, and he didn't let people talk about it. And he really had a way of cutting you off. I mean, he didn't want any pity expressed or anything. It was interesting.
He wanted to keep moving.
Yeah.
I'm curious. So, Shirley, you said you sent me a list of some questions, and one of the things that was popping out for me is that Banged Up Heart has won some awards. I'm curious, what awards has it won, and what does it mean to you?
Well, it had the first award it won was from the New Mexico Book Association, and that was for the cover design, which
interesting.
It's just funny. I didn't know there was any such competition for that kind of thing. But
you're like, I surely didn't submit this.
I did like the cover, and it was something that it was a group, a couple of friends, and my husband Frank and I over dinner, or before dinner one night. I'd sort of had this idea of how I wanted it to look, but I couldn't make it look beautiful. And they added something, and each person sort of added something, and then I presented it to the publisher, and the graphic artist made it look great. So that was an award.
Wow.
Then the other awards were for content. There was an Arizona, New Mexico group award, and New Mexico Press Women Award, and then the National Federation of Press Women awarded first prize to the video trailer that actually my publicist had put together. She interviewed me, and did this wonderful video trailer of the book, for the book. It's 3 minutes. And but the one that really meant, I think, the most to me was from independent book publishers. And it was a worldwide competition. And I did go to New York to pick up this medal that weighs, it doesn't weigh a ton, but it's a weighty medal.
You had to check it.
On a blue ribbon. And so it was very nice. And that was for the content. Actually, in the category, they awarded it as an ebook. I think it was Best Adult Nonfiction Personal Ebook is what they called it. So that's it. So it means, I think it means that I made it, that it was worthwhile. That's how it translates to me. That it's been worth. My book is worthy of attention by other people. You never know I was trying to make it meaningful. I wanted it to be meaningful to me. I mean, I was just writing for myself for the longest time. And then I think after my goddaughter said, this could be interesting to other people, I thought, well, if that's the case, I better go the distance and make it really worthwhile. So I just persevered.
Well, I'm glad you did, because you have such a great book, and now it's an audiobook too. I'm curious, because we're towards the end of the podcast, if there's any just final thoughts you'd like to leave with our listeners about either your experience, being a writer, whatever is important to you.
Well, the subtitle of my book, I mean, it's Dancing with Love and Loss, and I think my message to people would be to stay strong and keep dancing. I think it's much of our life should be intentional. Life is not just what happens to us. We do have choices to make, and I think it's important to recognize that and to make intentional decisions. I mean, at some point, as you referred earlier, I was trying to honor John's dreams, unrealized dreams. One of them was a solo exhibition of his photographs and all. And then at the moment that occurred, I realized this was not the dream that he died before he could have the exhibition he wanted. And I can't fulfill his dreams, and I've got to have my own dreams. Mm-hmm. So that was sort of what I call an aha moment, and I just that stayed with me. I said, Shirley, now you are alive, and you're going to keep going, and you're going to make your own dreams. So
that's a great.
You're going to have them and take steps to fulfill them. So
I think that's a great end note. You're going to have dreams, and you need to take steps to fulfill them. Shirley, I want to thank you again for coming on the show again. It's always a pleasure to have you on. You've been listening to www.aboutsexpodcast. If you want to find me, you can also visit me at www.therapistinstlouis.com. To all of my listeners, I'm your host, Angela Skirtu. I've been interviewing Shirley Melis with Banged Up Heart, author of Banged Up Heart, Dancing with Love and Loss. Stay kinky, St. Louis.